Welcome back to Research Business Daily Report, where today we're going to take a close-up look at the challenges that pollsters are facing as they gear up for this November's U.S. presidential election. RBDR is sponsored today and all this week by Decision Analyst, which integrates analytics into its portfolio of research and consulting services. And Decision Analyst invites you to read a new white paper it's prepared that compares segmentation approaches. We'll tell you how to access it at the end of today's report. Labor Day, which we hope our U.S. audience enjoyed this past weekend, is the traditional starting point of the United States presidential election campaign. So we thought it appropriate to spend our time today taking a close look at what pollsters are facing that is unique in this election. Now, Public Mind is part of the Survey Research Center, which is a university-based survey research organization at Fairleigh Dickinson University in New Jersey. And their polling work is very highly regarded. Who says so? Nate Silver and his 538.com organization, which has given Public Mind an A rating over the last few years. It is one of only 14 such pollsters out of 250 that have been examined that have that 538.com rating. Krista Jenkins is Director of Public Mind, and we spoke with her about what she thinks will make her job tougher during this election cycle.
The presidential election that we are moving towards is a lot more challenging for a pollster than it has been in the last two presidential election cycles. That is the case, right?
Yes, it is certainly more challenging. Why? Well, there's a number of reasons. First would simply be, I think, the nature of the candidates themselves. As I'm sure your readers and listeners are aware, we have two candidates who are historically unpopular. So that certainly presents some challenges because it's difficult to, I think it complicates our ability to figure out who is actually going to turn out to vote. Anytime you do pre-election polling, particularly in those ones that are done right before the election, when people are about ready to go to the polls, you have to figure out who a likely voter is. Because people often lie and they say in response to a question about, are you going to vote? They'll say, sure. And then, of course, you look at the actual incidence of people who turned out on Election Day, and there's quite a chasm of difference between the people.
How big a discrepancy have you traditionally found in that?
Oh, it can be 20 or 30 points.
Really?
So if you look at, if you just ask people, are you going to vote? Maybe 70, 80% of your respondents will say, yes, I'm going to vote. But look at the turnout rates in presidential elections over the past 40, 50, 60 years. They're not at 80%, 40, 50, 60% if we're lucky. Mm-hmm. So there is quite a difference. So in any event, what you have to do is you have to figure out who a likely voter is. And in this election, when we have so much volatility and we have, I would argue, potentially a lot of new people being pulled into the process by virtue of the candidates themselves, and also people who may decide that they don't like the candidates and therefore they're going to stay home, it becomes, I think, much more difficult to discern who a likely voter is this year relative to years past.
With all the publicity that Donald Trump has gotten and the interest that there seemed to have been not only in the Republican primary, but even between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton in the Democratic primary, what does the electorate that has not really been paying attention at all look like in terms of volume or percentage of the population?
Well, it's difficult to, it's hard for me to come up with a snapshot of who your non-voter is going to be. I would argue that if you just look, for example, at the debates and the fact that we had so many people who were watching these primary debates over the summer, I think that's an indication of how motivated people are to at least be following along with what's going on. But as for what your likely voter, your likely non-voter is going to look like on Election Day, they're probably going to look a lot like people who have not voted in the past, people who feel very disenfranchised. We know young people are notoriously likely to stay home on Election Day. They don't have those habits yet developed for voting. People from the lower socioeconomic strata are certainly those who are likely to stay home on Election Day. So as much as I think that this is very much an atypical election, I still think that we're going to see some predictable patterns emerge on Election Day in regard to those who voted versus those who chose not to participate.
analytics that particularly the Democrats have been using since Obama, but that Clinton is being able to use this year, what kind of impact does that have on likelihood to vote? Hillary Clinton ran for president 8 years ago. She's running again this year. How has the importance of gender changed, if at all, in those 8 years?
Well, we've polled on this question. We did it in 2008 and then again in 2016. And as I'm sure you're aware, if you ask anybody, would you not support a candidate because of their gender? Most people are not going to say sure. Most people are, I think, savvy enough to recognize that that's not a very PC thing to say these days. But the reality is that I think sexism exists, and I think that there are people who would be not the most comfortable allowing a woman to assume that position. So what we've done is tried to ask some questions that indirectly get at the importance of gender in people's minds when they're deciding whom to vote for in a presidential election. And the takeaway from our research is that there does appear to be some influence of gender, but the influence of gender appears to have gone down a bit from 2008 to 2016. Not that it's been completely erased, but maybe because of who Hillary Clinton is and the fact that she is known by so many, for better or worse, her gender is less salient in people's minds. But it has not been, I think, as much of a factor in 2016 as it appeared to have been in 2008.
Are there any more conspiracy theories or more serious conspiracy theories this time around than there have been in the past? And if so, what kind of impact are those having?
Well, we've asked questions about political conspiracy beliefs for the past, 4 or 5 years, public mind, maybe a little bit less. And what's interesting is we tend to associate political conspiracy beliefs with people on the right. And we actually find a fair number of people on the left who also endorse certain political conspiracies. So I think that there is a reservoir of interest, at least in political conspiracies in American society. They've been part of the rhetoric this year, as I'm sure you're aware, particularly on the right. But whether or not that is going to have any connection to how people choose to vote in 2016, I'm not sure.
Are you finding the American public has any changing attitudes towards participating in polls?
Well, we've certainly seen suspicions of pollsters increase in recent years. And I would argue a lot of that is because what often makes the news are the misfires by pollsters, not the accuracy, but the misfires. And so there have been some, recent elections where the polling field was off by a bit. But the reality is that polling is very much both art and science. And inevitably there are going to be times when the polls will be off a little bit. But if you just look at the totality of how accurate polls have been over the past, 30, 40, 50 years.
Do you think that this year's election, presidential, and obviously it's a 50-state election, it's not a national election.
Right.
Do you think it's a tougher job this year than it's been in the past?
Yes, I would argue that this election is going to be tougher because we already have the problems of declining response rate, cell phones, etc. But we also have a very volatile electorate right now. And we have new groups potentially being pulled in, mobilized to participate, but then you could also have a lot of people who find nothing to support in the two major party candidates who just say, I'm not going to vote. That's a choice in and of itself. So I think that given the difficulty of trying to figure out who is a likely voter, I think that is increased in difficulty significantly this year.
That's your Research Business Daily Report. We've been sponsored today and will be all this week by Decision Analyst, which integrates analytics into its portfolio of research and consulting services. Decision Analysts Elizabeth Horn and Wei Wang invite you to read their new white paper. It's called Comparison of Segmentation Approaches. It'll give you some important new information. Look for the link we've created and benefit from their insights. We hope you have a great research day and that you'll join us back here tomorrow.